Welcome to Release Readiness Live. I'm Elna Miller, your host for today. We are broadcasting from our home studios this week again to bring you some of the new features from the Winter 21 release. After our product team shares the highlights, we will be spending some time taking your questions live on the air. So we'll be monitoring both the Release Readiness Trailblazers community as well as Twitter. So post your questions as soon as you can and be sure to use the hashtag Salesforce Live. We do recommend you post your longer, more detailed questions in the community so the conversation can continue after the webcast. If we don't get to your question on the air, we'll be sure to follow up with you within a few days. Now, all of our webcasts will be available on the Salesforce Live website for later viewing. Since we may be talking about the roadmap and making some forward-looking statements, please make sure that any purchasing decisions you make are based on currently available functionality. Now, let's get started with Salesforce Flow.
Thanks, Elna. Hi, everyone. My name is Henry Liu. I am one of the PMs on the Flow team, and I'm very excited to be here today to show you some of the amazing features that we have developed over the last release. So without further ado, let's get started. First off is the multi-column layout. We got tons of feedback from you that you want to be able to customize the layout of your screens. And previously, the only way to do this is to write custom code for this. With Winter 2021 release, you won't have to do this anymore. You'll be able to drag and drop a section directly onto a screen element and add up to 4 columns and adjust the width for each of these columns. These columns are also responsive, so when you switch over to a mobile flow, you'll see that it will also auto-align with the mobile container. So let's take a look at what this looks like in a demo. Here I am on the work order record page, and you can see that I have embedded a meter reading flow directly into this record. So as a dispatcher that's on the phone with the customer, I am able to capture the meter reading about this customer's solar panel directly on this page. So here, let me enter in 17 kilowatts. And you can see the asset information is neatly displayed in 3 different columns across the screen. If I'm a technician on site using Salesforce Mobile, I can also capture customers' meter reading directly on the work order record page. On the top left here is my meter reading flow action. When I click on that, you'll be able to see that the asset information is responsive depending on the size of your device. So let me update to 21. And if I go back to the work order record page, you'll see that the solar panel reading is now updated. Cool, so let's now go back to Flow Builder and see how you set this up. Here I am in the Flow Builder, and if I go to the screen element, you'll see that now we have this brand new component called Section under Display. And in this section, I have 3 different display text screen components that shows the asset information. You can drag and drop any screen components that you want into these columns, which means that you now have the ability to customize your layout without using code. You'll have up to 4 different columns, and you can also customize the width of these columns as well. Great, so now let's go back to the slides. As a reminder, multi-column layout is in pilot in Winter 2021. We would love your feedback, so please do sign up with us if you are interested in trying this feature out. Next up is Autolayout Mode. Autolayout Mode will provide you with a more simplified and consistent way of building your flow. For those of you out there that are new admins or newer to flow building, this also gives you a guided experience so you can build a flow much faster and easier. We heard tons of feedback from you and our customers that Flow is more for the advanced users, and we want to change that. Flow should be just as easy, if not easier, to get started than workflow rules or process builder. So let's take a look at Auto Layout Mode live. Okay, now I'm back on my Flow Builder, And in the middle of this flow builder, you'll be able to see that there is this auto layout toggle that you can select. If you don't want to bother with aligning all these lines and nodes, and if you don't want to also worry about the overlapping text, then select Auto Layout and it will automatically format all these nodes and traversals for you. You can see these are neatly aligned, and you can create new elements in between them by clicking on these plus button. Or if you want to edit these, you can either double click like this, or you can single click and it will list out all the actions available for you. Now, this doesn't just work with screen flows, this also works with rest of the other types of flows that we have available. For example, I have this after state trigger that goes through your newly created opportunity and add the right task associated with the opportunity's record type. And this also works with auto layout mode as well. You can see here that loops are nicely displayed, so you can read them pretty easily. Now, we do have some gotchas that you should be aware of. So let me reload this flow. If you have more than one traversal into one single node, or if I have things like fault connectors like so, then auto layout mode won't work. We are going through and fixing these issues, which is why this is in beta. But this is available for all orgs, so feel free to try this out and let us know your feedback. Another feature that we introduced in this release is pills. Pills will replace your merge field text with a much more user-friendly label, so you can quickly tell what your input is. Also, by looking at the icon, you'll be able to tell what type of data is behind this merge field. We also introduced direct error messages in the flow builder within your error messages and warnings. You will have a link so you can directly navigate to the element where the error is at. This way, you don't have to guess where it is coming from. Lastly, for you developers out there, I am happy to introduce that the custom property editor is now available for your screen components and invocable actions. This is a way for you to customize the building experience directly in Flow Builder. I'm not going to go into details here, but if you are interested in setting up a custom property editor, please take a look at Alex Edelstein's previous developer session recording, where he goes through these features in depth. And now I'm going to hand over to Tim, where he's going to show you even more awesome flow features that we have done in the last few releases. Tim?
Thanks, Henry. Salutations, citizens of Flow Nation. My name is Tim, and I'm a product manager on Flow. Today, I am grateful for the opportunity to share with you all some of the amazing work the team has done in the last release to make you more effective, efficient, and effervescent on the world's #1 automation platform. I'm going to start this segment off with 3 general Flow goodies that I know many of you out there have been waiting for years. Then I'm going to talk about a few new triggered flow features we introduced this release that will make your low-code triggers faster, more powerful, and more capable than ever before. And finally, my personal favorites, 2 additions to the Flow debugging experience that I hope will make debugging much smoother, frictionless, and dare I say, fun. Let's dive in. I'll start with global variables everywhere. If you've ever played around with global variables in Flow, for example, if you wanted to display the running user's name on a welcome screen, you know it's not the smoothest experience. First, you've got to create a Flow formula variable to serve as a container. Give the formula variable an API name, then provide a valid Salesforce expression that will resolve to the content you want. Once you've got that Flow formula variable set up, you can place it in your flow. That's quite a few steps. So starting in Winter 21, you can skip all that. Just drop global variables inline wherever you need them, and get that glorious Flow autocomplete as well. Smile fondly as you reminisce on the bygone days of using formulas to express global variables. Enough said, really. Hope you enjoy. Now that was the appetizer. It's time to jump into something a little more meaty. Let's talk about Flow API versioning. Starting Starting in Winter 21, improvements to how running flows behave that are potentially backwards incompatible will be delivered with Salesforce API versions. Only those which are extremely urgent will continue being auto-enabled with release updates. Phew, what the heck did that mean? Let's pause for a minute and take some time to unpack that statement. Every release, in addition to building new features, our teams make around 100 minor improvements to Flow. These improvements can affect anything from the builder experience in Flow Builder to the Flow runtime experience, that is, how flows behave when they are running. Some of these improvements are bug fixes. Others are iterations on previous designs or architectural choices. We work hard to ensure that these improvements are backwards compatible. That is, we want to guarantee that when they go live, they won't break your flows that are running in production. Some improvements that make fundamental changes to how flows behave when they are running are inevitably backwards incompatible. Or in other words, the nature of the changes make it impossible to guarantee that they won't break a single flow in production, thanks to the insane number of flows out there, and also thanks to all the amazing and innovative things you do with Flow that we could never imagine. We release changes like these using the Critical Update console. When an improvement is released via Critical Update, you typically get around 1 year to regression test the improvement before it is automatically enabled. Now, if you've been keeping up with all the critical updates we've released in the last few years, you'll have noticed that some of our critical updates are security related, while others are more functionality related. Let's go through a few examples. Here's a critical update called Enforce Data Access in Flow Formulas. Essentially, until this critical update is enabled, Flow formulas do not respect object-level security, field-level security, or sharing rules. That is, when a flow is running, if a formula in the flow queries data about a case, such as the case's account or the case's account's owner, then object-level security, field-level security, and sharing rules are bypassed for the running user. This can result in unexpected or unintended privilege escalation, which we take very seriously. We've been making major moves across the platform to make privilege escalation very explicit. The delivery of this improvement was both urgent and potentially backwards incompatible. It was urgent because unexpected privilege escalation is a very serious affair. It was potentially backwards incompatible because some customers out there may have consciously built flows assuming the implicit privilege escalation was going to take place. Let's take a look at another example. Here's a critical update called Evaluate Criteria Based on Original Record Values in Process Builder. Now there's a mouthful. Put plainly, suppose you have a record that a process builder process runs against, such that a field on that record has a null value at the beginning of the process. Then at some point during the execution of the process, the value in that field is updated from its original null value to a new non-null value. Now let's pretend that a later step of the process, there's a criteria that's based on the value of that field. Contrary to what is publicly documented, that criteria will use the updated non-null value of the field and not the original null value. Not only is this different from what's publicly documented, it can lead to non-deterministic behavior that's extremely hard to predict and debug. This critical update fixes the defect and guarantees that criteria will be evaluated against the original record values at the start of the process. The delivery of this improvement was less urgent, but still backwards incompatible. It was less urgent because it wasn't creating potential situations where there could be privilege escalation or service degradation. However, there were almost certainly customers out there who had figured out ways to implement workarounds for the defective behavior. If we had quietly deployed the fix without giving them time to remove their workarounds, it is very likely their workarounds, when applied to the fixed behavior, would lead to undesirable outcomes. Thus, this improvement was backwards incompatible. Fixes like the latter will no longer be released with critical updates, but instead with API versions. What this means is, if you want to take advantage of a fix, you can do so on your own schedule by simply upgrading the API version of the flow that you want those upgrades for. And if you don't care about the fix, no action needed. There's no 1-year expiration date hanging over your head, at which time every flow in your org will be force upgraded to the new behavior, whether you're ready or not. We expect this will dramatically reduce the number of critical updates we release every year, thus dramatically reducing the amount of regression testing you have to perform to intake critical updates. Now, I want to be super clear here. It's only the backwards incompatible changes that'll be versioned. The vast majority of bug fixes and improvements that we make are all backwards compatible
and will be available to flows running on all API versions, even the oldest ones. Similarly, the vast majority of new features are also backwards compatible and will be available to flows running on all API versions, even the oldest ones. You won't have to upversion a flow to get access to these features. I'd also like to acknowledge urgent security and performance updates like the first of the two examples I went through earlier. Security and performance updates will be available immediately to flows running on the newest API versions, and also continue to be eventually auto-enabled for flows running on old API versions through release updates. This will afford you some valuable flexibility in how you will prepare for and regression test the changes. As you may know, when you enable a release update or critical update, its effects immediately apply to every single flow in the org. So, if you've got 100 flows to regression test, you can either regression test them all in one big bang, or you've got to play a very not fun toggling game where you enable the update, test a few flows, then disable the update and come back a few days later to re-enable it and continue testing. Now, you can simply upgrade one flow at a time to the latest API version and regression test it in isolation. So, let's recap the benefits. Aside from urgent security and performance updates, improvements to the way flows run that are potentially backwards incompatible will be delivered with API versions rather than critical updates. If you don't care about the improvements, we won't force you to take them. You can leave your flows running on an old API version, and they will run the way they did when you activate them. You'll still get access to just about all the latest and greatest features. If you do care about the improvements, all you've got to do is upgrade your Flows API version. And there's a benefit for us here on the Flow team too. Believe it or not, critical updates and release updates are actually extremely costly for us to perform and maintain. By putting changes behind API versions, we're able to fix bugs and deliver improvements to you all at a much higher rate. In fact, we're releasing a number of awesome improvements with Winter 21, or API version 50. Improvements to next and finish behavior in screen flows, improvements to the isBlank function. Read about them in the release notes. Don't worry, all your flows right now are running on API version 49. That is, they will continue working the way they did in summer 20. So you don't have to scramble to test these changes for regressions. Upgrade them to version 50 on your own schedule. Or don't. The choice is yours. As a reminder, you can upversion a flow in the Advanced section of its Version Properties menu. It's that little gear icon in the top left of Flow Builder. Alrighty. Richer criteria building, or OR support in record filters. As I'm sure many of you are quite painfully aware, Flow record filters, that is, the way you specify which records to get, update, or delete, with Flow's native get records, update records, and delete records data elements, have only ever supported two forms of criteria building. Either you can say, get me all the account records, or you can say, get me all the account records that meet criteria 1 and criteria 2 and criteria 3. You can't say, get me all the account records that are either investor, analyst, or press accounts, or have an annual revenue in excess of $10 million. Instead, you've got to construct that set of records directly in Flow by chaining together a few separate get records elements and then munging the individual outputs of those elements together into a record collection. It can be quite time-consuming to implement that logic, and when the flow runs, it'll consume more system resources than would be ideal. So, we finally delivered complex filter criteria building capabilities. If you're looking to get, update, or delete a very specific set of records that can't be described without the words or not, you're in luck, because now you can do it with a single element. And that's a wrap on the general flow goodies. I'm going to switch tracks now and talk about a few of the triggered flow improvements we came out with. The first two, record triggered flow entry criteria and advanced decisions for record update triggers, both happen in the start element. Let's dive in. I'm going to start with record triggered flow entry criteria. This feature will allow you to make major improvements to the performance of your triggered flows. Did you know that roughly half the times process builder processes run in production, they don't actually do anything? Let me give you an example. Let's say you set up a process builder process to fire whenever a case is created or updated. When active, this process builder process will always fire when a case is created or updated. Oftentimes, none of the criteria you've defined in that process will be matched, and so the process will terminate without having gone down any paths or performed any operations. We call these no-ops, short for no operations. The issue with no-op process builder processes is there's a non-trivial amount of time involved in simply initiating the process and then terminating it. It's as if you were in your room at home and said to yourself, I think I'm going to go to the supermarket. So you put on your clothes, tie your shoes, get out the door, go to the garage, get in the car, drive to the supermarket. Then you realize, I don't need anything. So you go home and lament that you've just wasted 10 minutes without getting anything done. Process Builder is architected such that each process on a specific type of record change, such as case creator update, goes through these initialization and teardown steps every single time any case is created or updated. Entry criteria for flow triggers allow you to first check if you need anything from the supermarket before you leave the house. You configure entry criteria in the Start node, and it's just like configuring the filter criteria in the Get, Update, and Delete records elements, or configuring the decision criteria in the decision element. Like you can now do in the Get, Update, and Delete elements, you can construct entry criteria that employ complex logical combinations of ands, ors, and nots. This feature will also allow you to reduce the performance overhead of having multiple triggered flows per object. While it's often recommended to have a single process per object, we know that it's not always that easy in real life. Sometimes there may be different teams that all want to put triggers on a core object like case, but don't want to step on each other's toes when it comes to the implementation. Or sometimes constraining yourself to have a bunch of different business logic driven by a bunch of different business use cases, all in a single process, leads you to an extremely complicated process that's harder to debug and lifecycle manage. By choosing your entry criteria wisely, you may find opportunities to split up logic driven by different business requirements or stakeholders into a number of smaller processes that can be maintained and improved with more agility. For example, perhaps you can get to a state where you have 4 triggered flows on case create, but know because of how you've set up the entry criteria that no more than 2 of them will ever fire when a case is created. Entry criteria is one of my personal favorite features of Winter 21, even though I wasn't the PM for it. We've also ported a fan favorite from Process Builder to triggered flows. The ability to say, execute the actions in this branch only if the field values that the record had immediately before saving didn't meet the expression criteria, but now do. You'd use this feature when you model a record's lifecycle as a progression through different stages. For example, you might model a case as passing through different stages of priority and want to have an email sent or an SLA started if cases are changed, such that their priority is escalated to P1, but not if cases are changed when their priority was already P1. This functionality can now be used as part of the entry criteria for a triggered flow. That is, you can say, only start this flow at all if the field values that the record had immediately before saving didn't meet the filter criteria, but now do. And it can also be used inside a triggered flows decision elements. That is, you can say, only go down this decision path if the field values that the record had immediately before saving didn't meet the expression criteria, but now do. Our goal here is to give you a lot of flexibility in how you design your processes so that you can choose the right architecture for your situation. Finally, I'm happy to introduce before delete triggered flows to the Flow Nation. I believe this is the very first time you can automate processes that need to happen when records are deleted. Before delete triggered flows are eponymously named because they happen right before a record is deleted. The mental model I use to conceptualize a before delete triggered flow is like this. When a user clicks delete, a request is made to the database to delete that record. Before delete triggered flows intercept that request as it's on the way to the database. They execute some logic, perform some actions, and assuming there's no errors, they complete and send the request back on its merry way. Because before delete triggered flows intercept the request before it gets to the database, the record hasn't yet actually been deleted. For this reason, before delete triggered flows can access records that are related to the soon-to-be deleted record, whether it's through a master detail relationship or through a lookup relationship. The canonical use cases for before delete triggered flows follow from that mental model. Use them to update summary fields on related records so that you can maintain good data hygiene or reparent child records if there are any business rules requiring such. Note that unlike before save triggered flows, which can currently only perform really fast updates to the underlying record, before delete triggered flows can do everything an after save triggered flow can do. That is, they can invoke invocable actions, create, update, and delete records. One use case that is not currently supported for before-delete triggered flows is you can't use a before-delete triggered flow to stop someone from deleting a record. This is something you can achieve with Apex using the add-error method, but we have not yet provided a no-code equivalent. Furthermore, you will find that trying to call add-error from a triggered flow by invoking an Apex invocable method will not succeed. Finally, deleting a record moves it to the recycle bin. Some records can be undeleted, that is, moved back out of the recycle bin before they are hard deleted from Salesforce. Although we brought triggered flow support for the before delete record operation, we did not bring support for the after undelete record operation. And one more thing before we transition to debugging improvements. If you've played around with triggered flows, you may have noticed that unlike other kinds of flows, like screen flows or auto-launch flows, you couldn't traverse object relationships to get to data in related records using dot notation or flow's autocomplete. This was an intentional decision. The way Flow traverses and resolves those relationships behind the scenes has important performance repercussions. These repercussions are particularly important for triggered flows, which can run against batches of up to 200 records at a time. While we could have simply reused the approach that Process Builder uses, we chose not to because we identified major inefficiencies in that design, which would cause performance to be particularly bad in orgs with a lot of interrelated objects. Instead, we took the extra time we needed to design and implement a new solution for resolving related record traversals for triggered flows, and this release we're happy to say that they're here, and much, much faster than Process Builder. Traverse away. Finally, debug improvements. The first debug improvement I'll talk about is Debug-as-User. This feature will allow you to run a flow in the Flow debugger and see the debug details almost as if you were a different user. One of the most common issues Flow admins face when debugging flows is that when they run flows in the Flow debugger, they're running those flows as themselves, not as their target users. Typically, Flow admins have very different sets of permissions than the people they're building for. It can be hard to design for, test, and debug issues related to user permissions and access. Debug-as-User is aimed at making it much easier. Before you start a debug run, you can select a user to run the flow as. Once you do, the debug run will begin as that user. Also, an entry is generated in the setup audit trail for the run. The concept is pretty simple, but there are a few catches. First, accessing the feature. This feature must be turned on before it can be used. Specifically, someone with the Modify All Data and Manage Users user permissions must go to Process Automation Settings and enable the feature. Remember that you also need Customize Application to access Process Automation Settings. Once the feature is enabled, you must have the Manage Flow and View All Data user permissions to use the feature. The feature is available only in non-production orgs. Next, understand the limitations of the feature. The impersonated user must have access to run the flow in the first place. If they don't have access, the debug run will fail. For security reasons, impersonation is not supported for actions performed by Aura components or Lightning Web components. What this means is that if you have a custom Aura component or LWC that itself performs some set of actions, for example, it queries a set of records or updates a set of records, those actions will be performed as you and not as the user you are impersonating. This also applies to a few of our own Flow standard screen components, which are built in LWC and perform actions, particularly the lookup component and the file upload component. The final thing I'd like to talk about today is the beta Debug-on-Canvas for auto-launched flows. If you've ever run an auto-launched flow in the Flow debugger, you'd know that after you click Run, the auto-launched flow runs the termination, the debug details are rendered in the right-hand panel all at once, and the entire left-hand side of the browser window is used to present the words, all done, the flow interview finished at blah, 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 change inputs, run again. If you've got a reasonably complex auto-launched flow on your hands, it's honestly pretty difficult to correlate what happened in the debug run to which elements on the canvas were executed. So we thought, why don't we just show you instead of making you connect the dots? So now, for auto-launched flows built in the freeform canvas mode, you'll see a new button called Debug-on-Canvas Beta. Click on that button, and instead of having a new browser tab opened, you'll see a modal. Inside that modal are the regular debug run configuration settings, but also a mysterious new setting called Show Query Limits in Debug Details. Check that box, set the inputs and hit run, and you'll see a few new things. Firstly, rather than just saying done, we'll highlight the path that the debug run took in orange. Now I've put a pink bounding box around that path here in the slide to make it super obvious, but I hope it'll be noticeable without that bounding box when you try the feature out yourself. Secondly, you'll see that for elements that consumed database operation limits, such as DML and SOQL, we have provided for you how much of those limits they consumed. That mysterious checkbox from earlier toggles this on or off. In this example, the update records element performed a simple update on a single case record. The case record had no triggers on it, so exactly one DML statement was performed against one database row. And that about wraps it up. Let's be honest, it doesn't matter what you're debugging, flows, code, life. Debugging is one of those things that you generally try to avoid, and when you can't avoid it, you just hope it's as painless as can be.
I hope these features, and a few more coming down the pipe, will bring you closer. Happy hunting, and let's kick it back to Elna for the Q&A.
All right, so that was some great content, and I see lots of questions have come in, so we are ready to take your questions live. If you have a burning question, type it in now, because we got a lot of questions to get through. So the earlier you post it, the more likely we'll be able to take it on the air. So Tim and Henry, let's just dive straight in. I'm going to start with a question from Powell. Will the admin have to update API versions on all flows with every new release?
I can take that one.
Okay.
So the admin only should have to update the API version for a flow if they actually desire the upgrades or the improvements that are coming in that version. These upgrades and improvements tend to be pretty minor in scope, and a lot of customers won't be affected. And so the best way to determine whether you should upgrade or not is keep an eye on the release notes. Every release, we're going to have a list of all of the improvements and decide whether any of the flows you own would benefit from them. And if they would benefit, then go ahead and upgrade them. But there's absolutely no need to. Old versions will continue to be supported.
Okay, so basically, best practice would be if there's something new in the API that's going to significantly benefit or improve a flow, or if it's going to address perhaps a performance issue or something like that, then it's good to look into it on a one-off basis, but we don't need to do like a wholesale upgrade.
Right.
Right, gotcha. This seems to be a little bit of a hot topic here. And so if, let's say you've got a whole selection of flows with all different API versions, Benjamin wants to know, like, is there a good way to just kind of understand without, going back into each release notes, what are the benefits for upgrading each one, or which ones to upgrade? He said it could get a little complicated. He understands, the need to upgrade, but just like it could be a bit of a project. So I guess maybe what would your guidelines be? Would it be just to sort of wait until a flow, has some sort of issue, or you're not able to address a particular requirement, or, how would you suggest going about it?
I would recommend, so I will say, this is our V1, right? This is the first release where we've released the feature. And so the scope of our deliverables that will help you understand the impact is the release notes. We are definitely thinking about other ways to make the transition between versions smoother for you. I think that the recommendation Elna gave is actually a very good recommendation, which is if your flow bumps into some sort of unexpected or undesirable behavior, that's a good time to go check the release notes. There's always going to be a section now for the changes, and the changes will both, communicate what the actual change was, but also what the impact is. And so, coming at it from an impact perspective, I hope will also make this easier.
Gotcha. So Andy also asked a related question. Is there a way to mass update API versions? So if you want to just update everything all at once, is there a way to do that? Or would you actually have to write a flow to do this?
So there is not. I don't believe that you can write a flow to do this either, because I don't think the flow has the
Darn it.
ability to hit the tooling API. So good question. Checking my knowledge. I think, part of the risk and the reason why we version things is that there's a chance that some flows out there will be incompatible with the changes. And so it is very important to always regression test whenever you upgrade a version.
And let's say you have a flow that's maybe 5 APIs behind.
Mm-hmm.
Do you need to step upgrade, or can you just go to the latest?
You can just go to the latest. So think about it as, if you're 5 versions behind and you upgrade 5 versions, you'll just get all the changes at once.
Got it. So you want to study those changes still in each step before you do something like that. One thing I was thinking about is the optimizer. Like I'm maybe we should ask the optimizer team if they're planning to do an analysis or include an analysis of flows and the APIs that are being used, and maybe call out, hey, here's a flow that uses an older API, and this particular flow would benefit from an upgrade. That actually would be really great.
That is actually a very nice idea. I'll take that offline and
we'll talk,
pull the string a little bit.
I'll get you connected with that. All right. So here's a question from Benjamin. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it a best practice to start a screen flow with the screen element and not put any other elements like get record in the beginning? Because he thinks that if the screen flow starts with get records, it would run every time the page is loaded, which could cause performance issues or perhaps even hitting limits. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's an interesting question. I know for sure that there are going to be some use cases where, your first screen is pulling data from a bunch of related records, right? And if that is the requirement that you have to display related data in the first screen, there's no way to avoid doing it get records. I would expect that for screen flows, the performance overhead should not be so big. When we look at and we profile the performance of flows across the site, typically the flows that hit the limits the most frequently are the backend flows. And what happens is somebody is uploading 200 records at once. And so there's a lot of compute going on there. I think there is something to be said for, being diligent and, not getting all records and selecting from that, constructing the queries so that you're not fetching more data than you absolutely need to, I think is helpful. But I do think there's going to be a lot of use cases where you can't avoid having get records at the beginning.
Gotcha. Thanks for that. So it depends is the answer, I guess, right?
Always depends.
Yeah. So Bruce wanted to know, how should I debug a record triggered flow? I'd like to be able to provide a record ID, much like I can provide input values to debug auto-launched flows.
So honestly, you can't right now. It's just a feature gap, right? I think that it is something that's on the roadmap, and we've been discussing like what is the right experience for that. But right now, the main priority for our triggered automation investments is to get to parity with Process Builder as soon as possible. And I think that debugging will probably come around shortly, hopefully.
Gotcha. Andy's question is subflows on record trigger available yet? No,
it's not.
Okay. Any idea when that might be coming?
I know it's not.
Forward-looking statement.
Forward-looking statement. So I know for sure that it won't be coming in the immediately next release. I don't know. I forget what the name is for the next release. The one after the one we're talking about right now.
Spring 21.
So spring. I believe the team is going to try to tackle it in the following release based on the current projections.
Okay, good enough. Thank you. From Carl, when is Flow going to support is changed or prior values so we can properly handle these scenarios with record change flows instead of having to use a process to launch a flow?
So that's a great one. So it is, I can say right now that engineers are actively working on that functionality. Is it the spring? Is it spring, the next release?
Next release is
one.
Okay,
spring
so it is
21.
the highest priority for spring.
Got it. Because that's
coming soon.
related to the process builder parity, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a big one. It's a big one.
Great. Gaurav asks, is there any way to do relative date fields on flow input entry criteria? Currently, you have to create a formula field on the object to evaluate that field.
Right now you can, right? So within flow, you can create a formula within the flow, or you can do a formula on the actual record itself. But yes, we don't have that functionality today to do that calculation directly on the right-hand column.
Okay, so if that isn't on the roadmap, then I guess we would recommend the good old ideas exchange and vote it up.
Yeah, it's definitely a good idea. We have a couple different use cases for those too.
Thanks. Jerome wanted to know, is it possible to convert a process to a flow? Or will it be possible perhaps when you do more work on that in that area?
So I'm aware of, I think Alex Edelstein, one of the product managers in our team, he has been working on that and he's coming up with a strategy around that. I do want to set expectations, and I'll say, I don't think that is on the near-term roadmap. There are some gaps right now which would just prevent you from being able to convert your process builder process into a flow. So it's definitely, it's being investigated, but probably not anytime soon.
Okay. From Powell, can you embed a section within a section?
That's a great idea, but we can't do that today. So I'll take that back to the team.
Yeah, sounds like you need a committee to help you fill up your docket there with even more stuff to do. Randy, hi Randy. She wants to know if there's a way to cancel the delete record.
So I think that the use case here is you've got a record that is related to some objects. It's got some related records, and you have business requirements that until those related records are updated to have point to a different one, you don't want to let the people delete. So no, you cannot do that without any code, and the way you would achieve it with code is not very elegant if you wanted to do that by starting with a before delete triggered flow in this release. But that is a use case that is very common. It's something that's on the roadmap, and we've been working on a design for it.
Great. And then Powell, related question from Powell, when exactly does the before delete flow fire? Is it before or after triggers?
Before, after Apex triggers? I'm not going to answer that because I always forget. So I'll take this one onto the idea exchange.
The old order of execution question. Yeah, that's testing your knowledge. Yeah, so you can get back to him in the in Twitter, because that's where he posted. And then Squire says, before delete triggered flows are great. How long until we can get those sweet after delete triggered flows? We're so close. Is it on the roadmap?
So after delete or after undelete?
After delete.
After delete. So to be transparent, I think that at this time we are investigating the priority of after undelete first, because that doesn't exist today. I would be interested to understand actually, what are some of those examples where you would need a after delete, something where a before delete does not suffice. I think if we can get some examples of that, that will really help us sort of justify prioritizing it over other things.
Okay, thanks. So Squire, serve up those use cases. And actually, I would recommend that you post that in the community so that we can have a longer discussion, if there's questions. So maybe transfer that question to the community. Ada asks, if you're just getting started with Flow and you want to learn and use these new features, what's the best way to do this? Trailhead, and will the Trailhead lessons have these new features soon? So do you know how quickly they get new features into Trails? I know that's
I'll
more of a
take that
Trailhead
one.
question, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you're getting started, I think there's lots of great contents on Trailhead already. But like for these new ones, we are working with our doc team to get those in. So
Mhm.
so they will be lagging a little bit behind for these brand new features that are coming out. But you can definitely look at other areas. So like in the community, we have a group that has lots of information, and you can ask people about different questions. And also we have this unofficial sf.com website with lots of information, great information there. And also you can even install packages like custom solutions there too. So check that out.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of Flohana out there, which is all the experts, those who already are, well versed in Flow, and they have already gone in and experimented with these new features, and a lot of them have written blogs and shared things in the unofficial SF, as well as the Automation Hour community. So they do webinars, and also it's just a great place to connect with Flow experts. And chances are somebody's written some stuff up already about how they've experimented with it and given some use cases. So definitely connect with those folks while you're waiting for the trails to be updated. Benjamin wanted to know if will Debug-on-Canvas beta be available on the Autolayout beta as well, or is it only available on the freeform layout?
I can take that one. So for this release, it is only available for the currently generally available freeform canvas. We're working on bringing that support to auto layout, but it won't be there in this release.
Gotcha. It's a confluence of betas on betas. I haven't seen that often. So Jordan wanted to know, will Debug-on-Canvas work with Apex actions or custom Lightning web components in the flow?
So Debug-on-Canvas, the main change in that feature is it will highlight the path that was taken through the flow. It is only supported right now for auto launch flows, and I don't believe that you can put a Lightning component into an auto launched flow. And when it comes to Apex actions, when you execute an Apex action as part of a flow debug run today, you see the inputs and the outputs from the action, and that's what you can interact with. So that is carried over to the debug on Canvas. Since it is an element, if it was executed, then it will be highlighted and there will be a path through it. But there's nothing specific about Apex actions that sort of makes a difference to debug on Canvas.
Okay. Question from Alexander. There are now 2 versions of auto layouts. For flows, there's Autolayout Mode, which is the beta, and then for strategies, Automate Node Layout. Will these types be consolidated in the future?
I'm not sure about that one. I'll check back on the community for that one. Let me know where to post this, and I'll try to answer.
Will do. Okay, thanks. Here's one from Victor. Before conditional logic, Flow recognized when a field in criteria was used twice and saw it as an or statement, not an and statement. For example, stage equals open, stage equals in progress. Now that conditional logic is available, will it still respect the 2 criteria as an or statement, or will it see it as an and statement? Or will the flow have to be updated to specify the or logic on API 50?
That's a great one. It's funny. I think yesterday I was chatting with a member on the team and getting information about the details, and she actually she bet somebody would ask about this today. So she actually told me prepare for this one. So I think it all starts from when we release new features. It's very important to us that we don't break you, right? If you have a flow that's running today, we try our very best to guarantee that if you miss the release, maybe you're on vacation or something, things don't just start breaking. And so for this example, I'll restate it for the audience. If you have a filter today and it's using an and you use the same field in that filter twice, it actually will then convert it to an or under the covers. We did some work to make sure that it will actually be gracefully converted on your behalf so that it will continue working the way it did.
Great. Thanks. That's very helpful. I'm sure everybody's heaving a sigh of relief now. They don't have to worry about editing that. So I think this is a question for Tim. This was from Mark. Can you provide a flow roadmap? Can you talk a little bit about the roadmap? I don't know if we have a slide, but he's wondering about future debugging features, stepping through each element one at a time, that sort of thing. Can you give us a few little tidbits about what might be coming?
Sure. So there's quite a few different roadmaps going on for each of our investment areas here in Flow. I think that, for screen flows and for triggered flows, you can actually find a roadmap, one-year roadmap in these things called Salesforce Architects Decision Guides. We keep those up to date. We released them, I think, back in July this year. So, we can post a link. If you Google Salesforce Architects Decision Guides automation, it should show up there, and there'll be a section that shows you what we're expecting to deliver in 1 year. Now, when it comes to debug, I'll talk about one feature that I'm super excited about, and I hope this helps you all understand how this this Debug-on-Canvas will lead gracefully into it. Is one thing we're trying to figure out is what happens today in production when somebody is using a flow and it goes into an error state. Well, the end user, they get a very generic error message, and then the last person who updated the flow gets an email, right, with all the details, and it's not the easiest thing to read. So one thing we're thinking about is, what if we could not force you to have to parse through that email, then open up Flow Builder and reproduce the issue based off the email, right? It's a lot of manual work. What if we could get rid of that for you by putting a little hyperlink in that email where you can click on that hyperlink and it'll open up Flow Builder and it'll highlight the exact path that was taken by that errored flow. And on the right-hand side of the debugger, it'll actually show you the trace of the flow, like what happened, right? So it'll be like you click on a link and you actually are seeing the trace of the flow like you just ran it yourself, right? So we call this sort of the one-click debug experience, something I'm super excited to be working on.
Very cool. Actually. I bet there's going to be a lot of excitement about that. And so timeline on that one, 2 releases, 3?
It is a top priority for one of my teams right now. This is a shorter release, so I don't want to commit to anything, but safe harbor forward-looking statement. I do think probably 2 releases is a pretty safe bet.
All right, looking forward to that one. So Ruth's question is, can we debug as user and debug on Canvas? She said that would be amazing.
You can. Debug as user and debug. Yeah, you can do that. And debug on Canvas, remember, it's only supported for auto-launched flows and auto-launched flows that are built in the sort of the freeform canvas. This is actually a good opportunity for me to mention the beta designation. So beta features, typically what we mean when we call a feature beta is that it's missing a little bit of scope, a little bit of functionality, such that we don't feel comfortable calling it a fully generally available feature. However, beta features are fully supported. So you can start using them, just understand that they might not offer 100% of the functionality you would be expecting. And we call those gaps out in the release notes.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's always good to keep that in mind. And, betas are often accessed in different ways. And so it's good to just remember that it's not fully baked, right? But still functional and supported. Pilots are different, but yeah. So Brian had a question about collecting IDs. So he says, we are using the IDs collection variable to call a screen flow from a list view, and he's having trouble with that feature. So, and I wrote a blog post about it. So you all might want to check it out, and maybe if you have anything to add about it today, if there's anything that comes to mind. Otherwise, he wants to know, like, how should send select records from a list view be, how should you add that into a flow? Like, I guess the way he's doing it is not working.
Yeah, I'm aware. So I do know that there is an ongoing investigation into this right now, but
Okay.
I don't know the most up-to-date sort of findings there.
Gotcha.
So we'll have to check back later.
We'll circle back on that one. Kelly asks, when debugging a record update flow, what is the recommendation for passing the record ID into the debugger?
So I believe that right now, record update flows simply can't be debugged in the flow debugger. I don't think there's a way to wrangle the debugger such that it'll work for that. So it is just a feature gap right now, unfortunately. And we're going to try and fix it or close the gap.
Okay, thanks. I think this is another API related question from James. If you upgrade a flows version and you find issues, can you downgrade?
Yes.
Good to know. Barry says, isn't there a best practice for flows saying there should only be one flow per object? I was surprised to hear you mention 4 flows on cases.
Yeah, so this is sort of an interesting topic that we talk about a lot in the product org. I think that when we talk about best practices, right, it's what are the benefits of the best practice that you get, right? It's about the outcomes. And so having just a single trigger on an object is nice, because if you have multiple triggers on an object, as you know, we don't guarantee what order they're going to fire in, right? So you have multiple triggers, like 4 triggers, there's potentially 24 different orders that those 4 triggers could fire in, and it's hard to debug and it's hard to maintain. The thing is though, right, a lot of customers out there, they'll have triggers that they've installed using a managed package. And if you're installing a trigger from a managed package, you can't really change that, right? So that's one use case where you can't avoid having multiple triggers. For some of our customers out there with many different sort of business units in their company that all operate on the same object, like case, right? Those different orgs might want to have their own sort of governance and CI/CD process for maintaining their automation, and then having just a single trigger that everybody's got to share, right? That can actually end up being more expensive than just dealing with multiple triggers and taking on that burden of managing the order, right? And so I think there's really not a good one-size-fits-all equation for all customers out there. And so what we're really trying to do with a lot of our features here is identify what are the benefits that these long-held best practices afford the customer, and is there a way we can give the customer those benefits even when they're constrained by things out of their control to having multiple triggers on an object. We really want to give customers the flexibility so that they can use flow regardless of what situation they're in.
Yeah, so there's no real hard and fast rule because it really is going to depend on your individual situation. But I think if you were, let's say you were an admin who is concerned about efficiency in maintenance, and you wanted to try to consolidate as much as you can in just so that you don't have too many things like for example, if you have an API change, and then having to test multiple flows as opposed to one. So if you're just starting out and you're not quite sure what your situation is going to be over time, what would be the best approach to take until, maybe you have a need to go one way or the other?
So I would actually recommend, in the absence of any context, right? I would say that the most important thing is actually not so much have only one trigger. But when it comes to things like performance and debugging and everything like that, especially for backend flows, what will really sort of create a headache for you is what we call recursion, or what we call reentrancy, which is having multiple updates across different places. Let's say you have let's just use an example, the case object. You could have a bunch of different automation that happens when a case is created. And what will really cause some headache when it comes to performance and debugging and everything is if across all of your automation on case, you have tons of different places where you're making updates to like the related account record. So minimizing the number of different places where you're making updates to the same object is really going to create the most value for you. And so identifying practices, identifying standard sort of operating models so that at any time, any point in time, you can easily see, where is all my automation that's touching the account object? Where all are the updates happening on account? Being able to identify those quickly and minimize them, by bringing them into a single update, that is really going to make your life better. And so that would be my number one recommendation.
Oh, that's really great advice. So it's not so much about how many flows, but it's what you're doing within them. That's really the most important thing. So thank you for that. So that requires more thought across multiple flows. Should these operations be all in the same flow and other operations be in others? So that's a great way to look at it. So appreciate that advice. So look, we are past the top of the hour, but I have just a couple more questions I want to try to squeeze in before we wrap up. So I have a really great one from Brittany. She says, our current documentation on which process should I use indicates that we should start with Process Builder and then pursue Flow if the automation is complex. Should we be starting with Flow instead, or what's the best practice today?
Oh, that's a good one too. So, I think there's actually, so myself and another PM on the team, Sam Reynard, the two of us back in July, August, we sat down and we actually wrote these pretty comprehensive guides, or, I mentioned them earlier. They're called the Salesforce Architect's Decision Guides that are meant to help you think through, I have a use case, I have a need for automation. And what we did is we said, all right, here are a bunch of the different automation tools in platform. And for each sort of use case, we actually give a recommendation based on different sort of facets of the use case on which one you should go for. And we did this both for record triggered automation, but we also did it for apps. So like, forms and surveys and things like that. And so, that's coming directly from us. I would recommend that as a good source of truth. The best way to find it, it's in our Flow collaboration group in the Salesforce Trailblazer community, but it's also published in Medium, in the Salesforce Architects Medium. You can find the Architects Decisions Guides there. So I think that's a really good place to start. We actually talk about a little bit of the design of these systems and why the underlying architecture of Process Builder or Flow may lead to the performance that you observe from these different tools. So I think it's a really great read. I hope there's a lot of really just interesting stuff in there that will help you understand why we make some of the decisions we do.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot now. I'm going to ask you to post in the community, because you've mentioned a couple of great resources. So if you could do a quick little post in the community, maybe later today or tomorrow when you get a chance, and just provide the links to some of those great resources, because I know I haven't heard of at least two of them. So I think a lot of our listeners would love to get those easy and quickly from the feed. So yeah, that would be great. Okay, let me just do one more and then we'll wrap up, because we got another session today too, so we have to get ready for that. Anthony, you get the last question. When will object fields be available to use in screen flows? Right now we have to recreate fields in standard or custom components, which results in an inconsistent UX. And he's thinking specifically about pick list fields.
Pick list field. What do you Could you repeat that?
When will object fields be available to use in screen flows?
So you should be able to use it with the record choice set, if that's what he meant. So record choice set, you can pick, or actually, sorry, object fields are in pick list choice set, and then if you want to select records, then it's in record choice set. So if you have a pick list field in a object, you can drag and drop a pick list, and then use the pick list choice set as the data source, and you should be able to get that data out.
Okay, so Anthony, if that doesn't address your question, just reply in the community and we'll have that conversation a little later today. So thank you for all the great questions. I certainly enjoyed the session and the conversation. We learned a lot of new stuff here today. So I do want to let you know that we have the recordings all on the Salesforce Live website. So the recording for this session should be up within a day or so. And we have another session coming up today at 11 on work.com, which is going to be super interesting, especially during what we're going through in this day and age. And we have 2 more sessions tomorrow as well. So definitely come back and join us. And I can't wait to hear how you are using new features to innovate. So let's keep the conversation going in the release readiness community, where all trailblazers meet to be release ready.